So guys, it's hard to believe that Insurgency Sandstorm is almost 2 years old now, and even though it did get off to a bit of a rocky start, you've actually got to admit it's come a long way since then. And not just that, but it's also pretty clear that it's evolved the identity of the franchise. The question is though, is that actually a good thing? Well guys, this is BillyEatWorld again, and let's find out. Alright guys, how you going? Welcome to the video, and to kick off, just before we get started, I just want to let you guys know that I've actually got a couple of codes for Sandstorm to give away with this video. I'm actually going to be giving them away over the next few weeks, but this time we're actually going to try something different. We're not just going to give them away to a random YouTube comment like we normally do. I'm not sure if you guys realize yet, but I've actually just started streaming Sandstorm and a bunch of other shooter games about 5 days a week over on my Twitch channel. And so to celebrate that, I'm going to be giving the codes away over there. All you have to do is head over to my Twitch channel, hit the follow button, and type !Insurgency Giveaway into the chat. As always though, check the description for all the details. Alright guys, so with that out of the way, and this makes me feel pretty old because it feels like yesterday, but like I said, Insurgency Sandstorm is actually officially going to be 2 years old in December. And to say that it's come a long way since then is obviously an understatement. If you remember anything from those early days, what you probably remember is that there wasn't a lot of content and it had a lot of performance issues. Actually, one of the first times that I can actually remember playing it was at the Insurgency booth at Gamescom in 2018. And I was thinking at the time, wow, it's kind of running pretty badly even on their own PCs. But even so, it was pretty obvious, even with all the bugs, that New World had stepped up the production a fair bit on this one. It was looking less and less like a low-budget indie shooter. But most importantly, I can remember thinking back then, they haven't just updated the graphics with this one, they've actually completely changed the identity of the game. Because back in 2014, Insurgency was probably one of the most unforgiving, skill-intensive shooter franchises available, and Sandstorm definitely dialed that back a fair bit. It's not to say that it didn't actually feel like an Insurgency game, it still had a super fast time to kill and typical hardcore mechanics like strong weapon recoil and suppression, but it was obvious that it wasn't nearly as brutal as the previous game. It was kind of a step back towards the feel of something like a more conventional style military shooter like Battlefield 4. Now, considering in the years before that, Insurgency 2014 had sold about 3.5 million copies, well, a lot of people were wondering why the devs even bothered to go for a different angle at all. And I mean, look, that's fair enough. 3.5 million copies isn't really that far off the sort of numbers AAA shooters sell on PC. And so surely, by that logic, you shouldn't try to fix what isn't already broken, right? But you've got to also understand, back in 2018, there wasn't many or if any games doing the modern warfare thing. And most importantly, Battlefield was still off making historical games. So a lot of people, not necessarily just hardcore shooter fans, including myself, were looking for something new to fill the void of games like Battlefield 4, which at that point was coming up to 5 years old. So bearing that in mind, it kind of made sense that Sandstorm would start to move away in that direction, and over the last few years, it's continued to move even further away from the franchise's roots. For example, almost exactly a year ago, in November 2019, Domination was introduced as a permanent game mode, which featured looser loadout restrictions and much faster respawn times. Probably most controversially though, just after that, the devs reduced recoil again by about 15%, they reduced scope sway by 20%, and they increased the top speed of sprinting by around 8%, which were all obviously changes that the devs made to make the core gameplay more familiar to casual shooter fans, maybe the sort of players who might say be into, coincidentally, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019. Now, obviously, a lot of veteran players weren't really happy with those changes, but I think the devs had also realized by that point that the skill cap of the game was turning new players away. And in December 2019, Sandstorm had a free weekend scheduled, so I think the pressure was on to try and retain as many of those new players as they could. And sure enough, if you take a look at the Steam charts, I think it kind of worked. The average active daily player count jumped from 1,200 up to 2,700, and since then, on average, it's continued to keep growing. So I think bearing that in mind, even if maybe a lot of the older fans weren't necessarily satisfied with the identity shift, at least it didn't seem to hurt the game in terms of the overall player numbers. Now, the real reason I think the devs made these changes when they did, though, was the fact that Sandstorm would eventually become the first Insurgency game to be released on console. And if you guys are familiar with this franchise, I don't need to tell you the elephant in the room is that the console release still actually hasn't happened yet. It's been pushed back multiple times since then from the original launch window of spring 2020. That date eventually got pushed back to August 25th, and they even started taking pre-orders, but once again, that's been delayed even further until, as far as we know now, sometime in 2021. And that's why I think a lot of PC players were confused about the shift to a more casual gameplay style. The devs were expecting a huge influx of new casual console players, but the problem is that still hasn't happened yet. Now, obviously, that's pretty important, but just putting that aside for a sec, probably the most important thing I want to talk about in this video is the state of the game currently and how it's changed since 2018. Because for me, as someone who actually is a fan of the slightly more casual identity of the game, the biggest reason that I wasn't putting more hours into the game initially at launch was, like I said, because it just didn't really feel finished. In my opinion, Sandstorm kind of felt like an early access game when it came out. It only had 6 maps at launch, and like I said, it suffered from some serious performance issues. And I think probably one of the main reasons that it didn't grow quicker after it first launched was that the dev team had to spend that first year fixing bugs and getting the game into a decent state, rather than putting time into creating new content. Since then, though, I'm happy to say the devs have released a bunch of major updates, all of which were free, by the way, including a ton of new weapons, new game modes, and of course, 5 new maps. And not just that, but since then they've also released night versions of every map in the game, as well as a bunch of crazy mutated game modes which are playable in timed events or on community servers. And speaking of community servers, well, earlier this year, another huge update to the game was the addition of modding tools, obviously throwing the door open for even more community-made content. And just recently, and I think this is one of the most important things they've done, is that they've stepped things up even further with their updates by releasing themed updates, which seem like they're generating a lot more interest in the community, and it seems like those players are sticking around. Now, bearing all of that in mind, though, I think the real question I've had for quite a while now is, considering Sandstorm is coming up to 2 years old, has it just been too long? And look, I think we'll have to wait and see as far as the console release goes, but as for the PC community, I know a lot of players probably have checked out already, but there's still a lot of life in her yet. For example, we've just seen games like Squad release from 5 years in early access with record player numbers, and also Rising Storm 2 resurrected by a free week on the Epic Store, which you might not realize are 2 games that also had to deal with performance issues and lack of content early in their life cycle. And since then, they've both managed to turn it around. Also, obviously, and I've been saying this for ages now, when Sandstorm finally does come out on console, I honestly think it's going to be a massive game changer for the franchise. Because really, there still isn't that many modern era hardcore shooters available at the moment, let alone on console, and there probably won't be for quite a while. Now, obviously, the console release won't directly boost the PC player base unless there's some kind of crossplay, but what it will do, I think, is generate a massive amount of hype. So as long as the console version, when it does finally come out, is stable and there's parity with the PC content, then I really honestly think even 2+ years down the track, that Sandstorm still has the potential to explode. But anyway, with all of that being said, just before we finish up, to quickly sum up what Insurgency Sandstorm is in 2020 and where it's at right now, well, first and foremost, I can definitely say it is still an insurgency game. It's still a gritty, realistic hardcore shooter with a fast time to kill and unforgiving mechanics. It's just not as unforgiving as the previous game, which in my opinion is actually probably a good thing. Are people still playing it? Well, like I said, maybe some of the Insurgency 2014 veterans have moved on, but in general, yes, there is still a ton of people playing it, even in smaller regions like Australia. And yes, I can probably safely say there's enough content now. For example, there's enough maps and modes that you realistically won't have time to get through all of them in one play session. Into the future though, well, we already know there's at least one more major update coming in 2020, and the devs have also committed to supporting the game through 2021. And yes, obviously there's still a few performance issues left to fix, but according to the devs, they feel like the game is in a pretty good place right now. There really isn't anything major broken at the moment. Lastly, and probably the most important thing, for you console guys, well, look, it kind of sucks that you've had to wait this long, but at least when it finally does come out, it will actually be in a better state than it was probably gonna be when it originally was meant to launch earlier this year. And like I said, really, I think it's gonna be you guys that push this game into the stratosphere. And obviously, that's gonna be a great thing, not just for us, but also for the franchise into the future. But anyway, guys, that's just about it for this quick retrospective review. So as always, make sure you let me know what you think in the comment section down below. And of course, just remember that I can't possibly cover every single detail of this game in a 10-minute video. So if you think I've forgotten anything important, make sure you put it down in the comments so that everyone else can take a look. As always, though, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and please feel free to check out the links in the description if you want to see any more of these videos. And also, don't forget you can find my Twitter and Discord links down there as well if you want to keep in touch. And as always, until next time, see you later, and have a good one.